Hello, I'm Anthea Hancox, the CEO of the Scanlon Foundation Research Institute, and we are delighted to bring you this special limited series of our Voices of Australia podcasts. As always, this podcast was recorded on the land of the Kulin Nation's Wurundjeri people, and we pay our deepest respects to elders past and present. I am welcoming you to the Scanlon Foundation Research Institute's new 6-part limited podcast series, Truth, Trust and Politics, a podcast that explores the complexities of truth, trust and political communication as we approach the 2025 federal election campaign. From mistruths and manipulative tactics to the erosion of trust in political communication, this series unpacks the dynamics that shape modern politics. We'll ask critical questions: who stands to gain from misinformation? Who's most vulnerable to its influence? And most importantly, what can we do to clean up our discourse and rebuild trust in our democratic processes? Featuring community thought leaders, politicians and policymakers, journalists and researchers, we'll explore the role of truth in shaping voter perceptions, the impact of social media, and strategies to counter the growing influence of mistruths. Join our guest host, Mary Gearin, award-winning journalist, MC and facilitator, as we examine how misinformation and the decay of trust impacts social cohesion, who it affects most, and what we can do to foster a healthier, more informed democracy. Mary's guests for this episode are Bill Browne, Director of the Democracy and Accountability Program at the Australia Institute, and Mark Kenny, political commentator and journalist and Senior Fellow at the Australian Studies Institute at ANU. They'll explore just how pervasive misinformation is and how it's affecting democracy.
Bill Browne and Mark Kenny, thank you so much for joining me.
That's a pleasure.
Thanks for having us.
We're talking about trust in political communication in an era where we're told that there is falling trust in institutions. I want to put to both of you, can you recall moments or examples when politicians have lost trust or successfully rebuilt trust with their constituents? What's been their approach? What's been the sort of thing that does actually build or lose trust when it comes to political communication? Bill?
The examples that come to mind are prime ministers responding to broken promises. So John Howard famously promising never ever a GST and then going to an election with the GST as a policy and legislating it, and seeming to survive that in part because he sought electoral approval for the change in policy. And then more recently, Anthony Albanese with the changes to the stage 3 tax cuts that made them much fairer and redistributed billions of dollars to low and middle income earners. And I think they're making the case for those changes and why there was a change in policy was crucial, as well as the fact that once that change was announced, opposition dissolved because it was clearly a much fairer change.
So it's not really about lying or mistruths in that case, it's about broken promises.
I think that's right. There does seem to be a difference between how those are approached versus the misinformation and misleading comments that are made in politics.
Mark, what do you think of that?
I think that's absolutely right. And the problem is that when you think about examples of coming up with either breaking trust or creating trust, the former category is much fuller than the latter, which is to say that we can think of a number of occasions when politicians have had to break their word or have broken their word, have altered what they said before an election and what they've done afterwards. Not so many cases where we see politicians taking tough decisions, having been elected midterm or whatever, and being prepared to really argue the case of those through. Now, there are some examples of that. Arguably, when Albanese flipped on not implementing the stage 3 tax cuts, he had a very good story to tell, which was that all taxpayers would get more money as a result, except for the very top bracket, which would still get more money than everyone else, but it wasn't going to get as much as was promised under the original stage 3. So it became an impossible thing for the opposition to stand in the way of, and a generally positive story for the government to tell. So there you have both elements, really, a broken promise and probably a good story to tell. And I think probably that worked well for the government, even though the media, in my estimation, took about 3 or 4 days to cotton on to this. They literally, I couldn't find any journos who were actually aware of the fact that there was no way Dutton could block this in the parliament because it involved him standing in the way of all taxpayers getting a tax cut, and a more generous one for most of them. Uh, the political arithmetic was pretty askew there for a few days as media banged on about Anthony Albanese's broken promise, about which the voters couldn't care a fig. I think, at least in that case, because they were getting more money.
Mm. So policy backflips and journalistic failures aside, though, there seems to be something, they've always been around, right? I guess. What's happened recently in recent years that you think is underpinning then this loss more broadly in trust in political institutions, Mark?
I think that what's happened is that politics has become too clever for itself. We know too much about what people think. There are metrics about everything now. If we think back to the politicians of, say, the war and the post-war era, we're talking about politicians who had an instinct for where the electorate was, had a set of beliefs, didn't always get it right, frequently got it wrong, or frequently took decisions which didn't make them particularly popular. I mean, we saw Chifley, for example, going out by continuing with post-war deprivations, rationing, and so forth, which was, in the years after the war, which was deeply unpopular, and some other policies that were seen as ideological by voters. And Menzies proposing to, unleash a sort of a new liberal order, which was going to be freer and more, and more kind of enjoyable for voters. And it's not hard to see who won that. But I think, generally speaking, politicians had a set of skills and a relatively small amount of empirical information about how their decisions would play in the short term. They had to actually make judgments about that. These days, they know everything about that, or at least everything that can be known, really. And I think it's paralysed. I think politics has become professional to the point of being cynical. I think voters don't any longer really believe much of what they hear because they realise they're constantly being played along. And if you listen to any political interview, you will hear that politicians almost never give a straight answer to questions. Everything is about their talking points. Everything is about sort of bending the answer to deliver the points that they went into the interview with a hope of making. And I think all of this has led to a sort of a sense of people knowing that they're being played, which is one of the reasons why when we get these people like Trump who come along, I mean, he might tell a lot of lies, but he does so openly. He speaks directly, and it's a strange conundrum that we now have so little trust in politics that people are prepared to be lied to as long as they know the lies are up front.
What do you think about that notion, Bill, that essentially it's all about authenticity rather than truthiness or respect for the truth?
Mm. Well, I think the flip side of politicians knowing much more about the electorate and much faster than they used to is that the electorate can find out a lot more about politicians, and I think we see that um, comments that in a pre-internet age might have faded away into obscurity can be revived and brought up again with the 24-hour news cycle. You're hearing constantly about the latest outrage and the latest bad behavior, as well as all the old stuff being archived as well. So while I do wish that we had politicians who stepped up, who showed more authenticity, and were more forthright in what they say, I am sympathetic too to the idea that the fallibility of the politicians of earlier generations may have been less on display than it is now. Um, Even something as simple as photographers being at every event and catching every awkward moment and misstep, even when there's no insincerity involved, they're still captured in these moments of fallibility.
Mm. What would you also say, Bill, though, to this notion that people are more willing to be loose with the
Think
truthfulness of what they hear, that's not the most important thing on their radar when Australian Institute has established that the majority of people do have wanted truth and political advertising laws, and yes, Maybe it's all
think
just being caught on the model or the devil in the detail and so forth. How do you marry that? We know that the political will isn't there to push it through, but how do you marry that within the electorate, that
think
what people want?
hmm, I'm hoping that the political will around truth in political advertising laws will crystallise. We've seen support across parties in Victoria, not enough to get it over the line, but with support from parliamentary committee there. Just recently in Queensland, it's been ventilated as a possibility by the incoming Premier, David Crisafulli. And of course, federally, the Albanese government introduced legislation, although not actively pursuing it. So I think it's still an idea, the moment of which is to come. But I think, yeah, Australians want politicians to be honest and forthright with them. Truth in political advertising laws wouldn't address every problem with misinformation in politics, but they'd go a long way to improving the quality of the discourse. And I think it was particularly interesting. We did polling following the Voice referendum, a campaign which was marred by misinformation, particularly on the no side. But voters, both for the yes and no case, supported truth in political advertising laws and identified that there'd been misinformation circulated during the referendum. So it wasn't an issue that split on ideological grounds. People recognised the problem. And I do think in recent years we've seen an escalation, almost a tit for tat between political parties, which makes the need for truth in political advertising more urgent to kind of nip the downward spiral in the bud. Because I think it's very natural as a politician, if you feel like 3 years ago your opponents very successfully ran a misinformation campaign against you, the temptation to do the same back against them is very strong unless you have a circuit breaker.
Mark, do you think that the time for these laws will come?
Uh, I don't know. I don't see a lot of resolve for it at the moment. The government seems to have backed away from it and doesn't indicate any support for it even in the next term, from what I've read. And the coalition doesn't seem particularly interested in it. I do think these sorts of laws are problematic. That doesn't mean they're impossible, but it does make drafting them and enforcing them, I think, a challenge. It's not to say it can't be done, and it's not to say it shouldn't be done. Let's face it, it would be great if we had a much higher level of integrity and honesty and perhaps a lower temperature in our debate, less of a recourse to exaggeration and misrepresentation. After all, we're asking people to make a pretty serious decision about who should govern, who should be given that responsibility, and they should be doing that on the basis of pretty reliable information. The difficulty, of course, we have is that politics in democracies is a very rhetorical space, just like a courtroom, I suppose, in a trial. There's a lot of packaging of information and presentation of evidence in a particular way to add up to deliver people to a certain favourable conclusion of one side and an unfavourable conclusion of their opponents. And that makes it a very difficult challenge to try and codify what is legitimate kind of in the theatre of political contest and what is over the, outside of the bounds of acceptability. And of course, there are new entrants to politics all the time, aspirants, people trying to break in, as it were, into the parliament, into the life. And as a result of that, they are less schooled, I think, and less resourced, trying to get attention. You've got third parties, which, as Bill said, in relation to, for example, the Voice campaign, we saw Advance and other organisations plugging a whole lot of irrelevant and factually incorrect information. It was a very low point, I think, in public discourse in this country. So I can feel the need for it, but I can see that it's hard to see in the short term that we're going to get there.
And part of the complex picture on this, not suggesting at all that I think we can all agree this is not America, neither in terms of the amount of sheer lies that are out there potentially in election campaigns or the audience's willingness to accept it and embrace it. But there is a shifting picture here where, similar to America, there's the decline of traditional media, the rise of more influential non-journalists in this space. There's a lot of research to say that younger people consume news completely differently, might willing to hear someone's opinion, accept it, and tolerate it, not take it necessarily as gospel. They've got a different reaction to this idea of how truthful something needs to be in order for them to listen to it. What do you think of that um,
think
that sort of picture, Mark, when it comes to how we navigate that space, particularly for a younger generation?
You're right. It's a changing picture all the time, and it's very complicated. And I think people of our generation, perhaps you and me, Mary, more than Bill, um,
Yeah.
are probably a little bit behind in understanding it. And our democratic institutions and our traditions, our sort of norms, perhaps are, are as oil and water to these new realities, and that makes it very hard. I think going back to the point about wanting politicians to be more honest and having laws, for example, to do it. Um, One of the ways that's been handled in the past has been with a very robust media that was prepared to hold political actors to account. It used to be the case. I'm old enough to remember a time where if you were caught in a lie, basically you either, depending on the severity and the intent of that lie, you were either required to resign. Certainly, you would have to apologize and accept that you lied. What we saw in the US recently was a complete abrogation of that. That's gone. That's old hat. That sort of thing. I mean, lies are just used now along with rumor, opinion, everything else. It's this sort of postmodern pastiche where everything has essentially equal meaning. Like you were saying, Mary, opinion and fact and charge and allegation and whatever other rhetorical form might emerge. All of these things seem to be given, maybe it's an exaggeration to say equal weight, but very, very considerable weight. And that makes it extremely hard. And I think this is the challenge for media. Look, if we think of a figure like Donald Trump, and he's good to pick out because he's so extreme, and you can therefore see the problem very starkly. Um, he lies so much. He's guilty of so many things. You know, we know he had 41 indictments, whatever, 34 indictments, whatever it was. We know all about. You know, we don't need to go through the list of his crimes and misdemeanors and outright falsehoods that he spouted every day, along with a whole lot of really nasty invective. How do media treat that on an ongoing basis? Do you mention every time you mention Donald Trump in the first two or three parts of your news story that he's the twice impeached president who has 41 indictments or whatever it was? And you can't, of course. And so what happens after a while is that you're just saying Donald Trump as if he's the same as every other political actor. So methodologically, within a democracy, that becomes a problem. His poor behaviour, what I would say was appalling behaviour in every respect, an absolute affront to a civil democracy, was nonetheless priced in by voters eventually and no longer had any currency. It just didn't matter. And so those of us observing it from afar, and a good many on the democratic side and in what you might call the legacy media, were assuming that the system would correct itself on account of all of his shortcomings. But it turned out the opposite was the case. His shortcomings convinced enough voters that he was so outside the institutional system as to be the attractive candidate. What can you do?
Oh, good question, Bill. What can you do about bad faith actors who are essentially confounding our sense of right and wrong when it comes to communication, essentially?
Look, I don't think there's any one silver bullet that's going to address all of the varied and distributed problems that we face in terms of honesty and forthrightness in politics. And when advocating for truth in political advertising laws, for example, I'm always quick to note that they cover a limited form of political expression, that's fixed in form, that can be traced back to the person who produced it. That still accounts for a large share of the media and political content that's consumed by people when deciding how to vote. But there's also whole realms that we're not necessarily closely following or aware of. That can be anything from the micro targeting of Facebook ads to very particular niche interests to messaging platforms that might be used by particular communities that journalists may not be in, may not be aware of happening at all. Um, so I don't think there's any one solution. I do think people are as interested in the truth and as concerned about veracity as they ever have been. The mediums by which people access information are changing, and some of them are quite brief and potentially superficial. A short clip of video is never going to give as much information as a long form essay, for example. But those essays are still being written and read.
Are they being read?
I think so, yes. And of course,
by ordinary voters?
by some, I think, by as many as ever were, would be my guess, although I don't know that we have the information to find out one way or the other. And we've seen the rise of things like citizen journalists who can use a social media platform and kind of desktop research to produce new and novel findings that people care about. So there's a lot to be worried about, but I don't think it's entirely bleak either.
And certainly there's a level of journalistic existential crisis when it comes to these things, when we know that these trusted voices are now outside journalism and, not regulated and, not up to the standards and so forth. But if that's the case, if are politicians who then go to those places and relate to people like that, is it still not more important for them to engage with the needs of their audiences? And it goes to how potentially alienated communities or underrepresented communities are actually feeling with them. Do you think that that's the core part of the thing that needs to be addressed when it comes to trust in political communication?
So one thing I'd suggest is to take democratic participation seriously. The Australia Institute made a submission to the government's inquiry into democratic participation, which was particularly concerned with electoral participation, people showing up and casting their votes. And there's been a small decline in turnout there, but Australia does so well on the whole on electoral participation that I really think that, yeah, exactly, compulsory voting makes a huge contribution there. The soul searching is really needed for how politicians talk about and interact with democratic participation more generally. And the classic example is protests, which are a fundamental part of public participation, and yet they are spoken down about, criticised, sometimes actively criminalised and punished by politicians, even those who have all the usual bromides about the importance of historical protest movements and the contributions that they made. But it goes further than that too. The decline in political party membership and new changes to how political parties are funded further separates the political parties from those mass movement bases that used to be where parties got their money and support from. But now, with less than 1% of the population as part of a political party, that's no longer the case that people are brought into these processes. And the same goes for all kinds of other ways that consultation is treated as an afterthought. Legislation is rushed through without the standard processes. Politicians who want to re-engage with the community, I think, need to do so by taking the idea that the community has something to offer seriously and doing something about it.
Mark, how much do you think that the politicians in that big house on the hill really do engage, like Bill says, in a fair dinkum way with their constituents? I mean, I guess we can make all sorts of analyses given on them losing their bases, but what do you think?
Well, I think it probably need to be fair to politicians here and accept that most of them have a pretty good ear on their local communities. The danger here is, though, that they have an ear, and I've seen some research that Ipsos has done and released quite recently that backs this up, that politicians have a pretty good idea of what their constituents think about given issues. And often they're aware of a fairly significant gap between the factual base of that issue and the perception of that issue. And will often see them playing to the perception because, in a sense, they have to. It's a very difficult thing to educate an electorate. We don't see it so often in politics. We have seen political leaders who are better at it than others. I think Paul Keating was good at it for a period, particularly when he was treasurer. I mean, it came at some cost as well, but the ability to explain complex issues and put forward sometimes short-term pain in order for longer-term gain, that's the kind of thing that over the longer haul, I think, potentially can build trust. But this perception gap is really quite high. The Ipsos report I was looking at, for example, and it's done over a whole number of countries, 33 countries is a sort of a fairly common representative figure of where they're asking these questions. And it cited, for example, one that showed that Americans believe that girls or young women aged between 15 and 19 have about 25%. 25% of them are giving birth every year. Now, the actual figure is 3%.
Wow.
And the same sorts of disparities exist between perceptions of local crime and actual crime in particular areas, in particular cities. Also, the representation of migrants in jails and in crime statistics vastly overrepresented. Now, all of these areas are areas where politicians can speak to a perception and campaign, and they'll make short-term gains as a result of that. Not only that's only the smallest part of the damage. The bigger part of the damage is that this cements these kinds of misrepresentations, represents them in Parliament, speaks about them as if they are fact, and so forth. And and all of that ends up being quite corrosive, I think, to social unity, to good policy, and probably to trust in the end, as we get vaulting cynicism in the electorate.
Yeah, it's a pretty bleak observation you've got there. It makes me think, what's the evidence about how important things like grassroots campaigns are to, or methodologies like town halls that we saw, are much more traditionally in those presidential campaigns as we saw recently. What's the sort of evidence that those sort of campaigns or approaches could be used to, as you say, kind of educate the electorate, Mark? But Bill,
well, I think sorry, just if I could jump in there, Mary. I think that, just to be a bit of a smart ass, I think the evidence is in a crossbench of 16 people or whatever it is at the moment. That is evidence of how you can do politics differently. And I'm particularly impressed by the way a lot of those local campaigns were organised and the quality of the candidates that came forward. And I think you could look at, for example, the Teal candidates, and if you had some reasonably objective way of measuring the quality of MPs in the Parliament, they'd probably be in the top 20 or 30 MPs of the whole 151 in the House of Representatives, just in terms of their diligence, their intelligence, their willingness to pursue issues and largely campaign on policy. They are good MPs, and mostly they're the result of voters in those largely educated electorates preferring a new form of politics. So I think, in a sense, what we're dancing around here, or what we're getting to here, is that democracy needs to update its forms if it is going to survive this blizzard of misinformation and cynicism that is coming at it, and people gaming it. There is so much information, as I was saying before, around that it has become a difficult locomotive to keep on the tracks. And the way, I think, to do it is to look at citizen-initiated referendums, citizens' juries, whole local bases for political movements, and probably accept that the idea of majority governments is a thing of the past, because that involved a different trust bargain than is possible in today's much more sort of multifactual, multicultural, multipolar electorate.
We're running out of time, but Bill, I must get your response on that. What do you think about that to recreate democratic forms? And also, just to pick up on something that Mark said, and to take it beyond the highly engaged, better educated electorate, better news engagement electorate, and really take it beyond those people and make sure that everyone is represented and engaged.
I think what our democracy benefits from is a range of options presented to the public, and that means not just a range of ideological positions, but also a range of different ways of selecting candidates, of organising political movements. I think it's clear that the voices of groups connected to the community independence have been able to offer something for people who didn't feel served by political parties. On the other hand, I think the political party structure has a lot to offer as well, and a system in which both of those options for engagement are available is likely to be one where we see more people turning out and getting involved on the whole. I think it's true too that the kind of splitting of different groups and interests in our society can be represented by the emergence of more targeted offerings. In the past, that maybe happened more under the party umbrella. Famously, kind of if you go back to the 70s, the 80s, and even before then, there were Liberal backbenchers who'd crossed the floor hundreds of times. And you can imagine that someone casting their vote for one of those backbenchers was making a selection that was different to the general package that was available. I think we see now less visible dissent within political parties, which means the public sees less of a choice within a kind of intra-party contest. And sorry, I've forgotten the second half of that question.
No, that's all right.
Can I just jump in there, Mary? Just a very quick point. I think I'd single out Bridget Archer, the member for Bass, as someone who has crossed the floor, I think, more than 40 times. So I may have that wrong, but it's a very significant number anyway, and she hasn't made herself all that popular for doing so. The one thing I would say, because I agree with everything you said, Bill, the thing that worries me is how the parties are responding to the advent of these new forms. And we see with they're getting together on campaign financing, putting spending caps in and donations caps and so forth in. We know that is, if it's acceptable to the two major parties, we know why. And it's because they are protecting the old model. And at the moment, they have the numbers in the parliament to do that. So, the media need to be a bit more muscular in this and actually call this out much more, because it's not in the interest of democracy to have fewer voices, and yet the major parties would like to keep it as a closed shop.
I've been disappointed by the fairly limited amount of media interest in some of the most significant changes to Australian electoral law. And indeed, in South Australia, there are in some ways even more ambitious changes being made, again, with very little scrutiny. And as Mark says, while it's good to regulate political finance and to particularly know who is funding political parties and MPs, on the whole, the changes seem deliberately designed to make an independent campaign impossible, while leaving it open to the major parties to spend sums of money that they have always spent, while limiting their challenges.
Old guard versus new guard. We'll have to see how that battle progresses. We'll have to leave it there. Bill Browne and Mark Kenny, thank you.
Thank you, Mary. Thanks, Bill.
Thanks, Mark.
Thank you for listening to our podcast. For more episodes, check out our website at scanlaninstitute.org.au.